The Memoirs of the Reverend George Whitefield, Chapter 12, from his embarking for America in 1744 to his going to the Bermudas in the year 1748. In the beginning of August 1744, as soon as the convoy came, footnote, August 4th, our convoy is now come. I desire you all to bless God for what he is doing in these parts. For preaching in the dock is now like preaching at the tabernacle. Our morning lectures are very delightful. Oh, the thousands that flock to the preaching of Christ's gospel. P.S. I must tell you one thing more. There is a ferry over to Plymouth. The ferrymen are not so much my friends, but they will take multitudes that come to hear me preach, saying, God forbid that we should sell the word of God. End of footnote. Mr. Whitefield embarked, though in a poor state of health, and after a tedious passage of 11 weeks. Footnote. His letter to the clergy of the diocese of Lichfield and Coventry is dated during this journey. End of footnote. Arrived at York in New England. Colonel Pepperell went with some friends in his boat to invite him to his house, but he declined the invitation, being so ill of a nervous colic that he was obliged immediately after his arrival to go to bed. His friends expressed much anxiety in his behalf. An eminent physician attended him, who had been a deist, but was awakened the last time he was in New England. For some time he was indeed very weak. Yet, he writes, in these 3 weeks I was enabled to preach, but imprudently going over the ferry to Portsmouth, I caught cold, immediately relapsed, and was taken, as everyone thought, with death in the house of my friend Mr. Sherburne, Sherburne. What concerned me was that notice had been given of my coming to preach. While the doctor was preparing a medicine, feeling my pains abated, I, on a sudden cry, Doctor, my pains are suspended. By the help of God, I will go and preach, and then come home and die. In my apprehension, and in all appearance to others, I was a dying man. I preached. The people heard me as such. The invisible realities of another world lay open to my view. Expecting to stretch into eternity and be with my Master before the morning, I spoke with peculiar energy. Such effects followed the word. I thought it was worth dying for 1,000 times. Though wonderfully comforted within, at my return home, I thought I was dying indeed. I was laid on a bed upon the ground near the fire, and I heard my friend say, he is gone. But God was pleased to order it otherwise. I gradually recovered, and soon after a poor Negro woman would see me. She came, sat down upon the ground, and looked earnestly in my face, and then said in broken language, Master, you just go to heaven's gate. But Jesus Christ said, get you down, you must not come here yet, but go first and call some more poor Negroes. I prayed to the Lord that if I was to live, this might be the event. In about 3 weeks I was enabled, though in great weakness, to reach Boston, and every day was more and more confirmed in what I had heard about a glorious work that had been begun and carried on there, and in almost all parts of New England for 2 years together. Before my last embarkation from Georgia, Mr. Coleman and Mr. Cooper wrote me word that upon Mr. Tennant's going out as an itinerant, the awakening greatly increased in various places. Footnote. See Prince's Christian History, Volume 2, page 304, where are attestations of about 120 ministers to the goodness of the work. End of the footnote. Till at length the work so advanced everywhere that many thought the latter-day glory was indeed come, and that a nation was to be born in a day. But as the same sun that lightens and warms the earth gives life to noxious insects, so the same work, thought for a while carried all before it, was sadly blemished to the subtlety of Satan. Footnote. Thus it was at the Reformation in Germany. End of the footnote. And the want of more experience in ministers and people who had never seen such a scene before. Opposers who who waited for such an occasion did all they could to aggravate everything. One rode several hundred miles to pick up all the accounts he could hear of what was wrong in what he called only a religious stir. And God having been pleased to send me first, all was laid upon me. Testimony signed by various ministers came out against me. Footnote. He wrote an answer to a testimony by Harvard College. End of footnote. Almost every day. And the disorders were also at the highest, so that for a while my situation was rendered uncomfortable. Footnote. While some published testimonials against Mr. Whitefield, others published testimonials in his favor, as Mr. Hobby, Mr. Loring, 15 ministers conveyed at TAUNTOM, March 5th, 1745. The following paragraph is in Prince's Christian History, number 94. Saturday, November 24, 1744, the Reverend Mr. Whitefield was so far revived as to be able to send out from Portsmouth to Boston. Whether he came in a very feeble state the Monday evening after, since which he has been able to preach in several of our largest houses of public worship, particularly the Reverend Dr. Coleman's, Dr. Sewall's, Mr. Webb's, and Mr. Gee's, to crowded assemblies of people and with great and growing acceptance. At Dr. Coleman's desire and with the consent of the church on the Lord's Day after his arrival, he administered to them the Holy Communion. The last Lord's Day he preached for Mr. Chevenix of Chelsea and administered the Lord's Supper there. The next day he preached for the Reverend Mr. Emerson of Malden. Yesterday he went out to preach in some towns north and purposes to return hither the next Wednesday evening, and after a few days to comply with the earnest invitations of several ministers to go and preach to their congregations in the southern part of the province. He comes with the same extraordinary spirit of meekness, sweetness, and universal benevolence as before. In opposition to the spirit of separation and bigotry, he is still for holding communion with all Protestant churches. In opposition to enthusiasm, he preaches a close adherence to the Scriptures and the necessity of trying all impressions by them and of rejecting whatever is not agreeable to them as delusions. In opposition to the antinomianism, he preaches up all kinds of relative and religious duties, though to be performed in the strength of Christ, and in short, the doctrines of the Church of England and of the first fathers of this country. As before, he first applies himself to the understanding of his hearers and then to the affections. And the more he preaches, the more he convinces people of their mistakes about him and increases their satisfaction. End of footnote. But amidst all this smoke, a blessed fire broke out. The awakened souls were as eager as ever to hear the word. Footnote. A man of good parts, ready wit, and lively imagination, who had made it his business in order to furnish matter for preaching over a bottle, to come in here and then carry away scraps of my sermons, having one night got sufficient matter to work upon, as he thought, attempted to go out, but being pent in on every side, he found his endeavors fruitless. Obliged thus to stay and looking up to me, waiting for some fresh matter for ridicule, God was pleased to prick him to the heart. He came to Mr. P. full of horror, confessed his crimes, and longed to ask pardon. End of the footnote. Having heard that I had expounded early in Scotland, they begged I would do the same in Boston. I complied and opened a lecture at 6 in the morning. I seldom preached to less than 2,000. It was delightful to see so many of both sexes neatly dressed, flocking to hear the word and returning home to family prayer and breakfast before the opposers were out of their bed, so that it was commonly said that between early rising and tar water the physicians would have no business. It was now spring, 1745, and at that time the first expedition was set on foot against Cape Breton, Breton. Colonel Pepperell, who was then at Boston and constantly attended Mr. Whitefield's lectures, was pleased the day before he accepted a commission to be general in that expedition to ask Mr. Whitefield's opinion on the matter. He told him with usual frankness that he did not indeed think the scheme proposed for taking Louisbourg very promising, that the eyes of all would be upon him. If he did not succeed, the widows and orphans of the slain soldiers would be like lions robbed of their wealth. But if it pleased God to give him success, envy would endeavor to eclipse his glory. He had need, therefore, if he went, to go with a single eye, and then there was no doubt. But if Providence really called him, he would find his strength proportioned to that day. About the same time, Mr. Sherburne, another of Mr. Whitfield's friends, being appointed one of the commissioners, told him he must favor the expedition, otherwise the serious people would be discouraged from enlisting. Not only so, but insisted he should give him a motto for his flag for the encouragement of the soldiers. This he refused to do, as it would be acting out of character. Mr. Sherburne would take no denial. He therefore at last gave them one: "If Christ be captain, no fear of defeat." Upon which great numbers enlisted, and before their embarkation the officers desired him to give them a sermon. This he readily complied with, and preached from these words: "And as many as were in debt came to David, and he became a captain over them." He spiritualized the subject and told them how distressed sinners came to Jesus Christ, the Son of David, and in his application exhorted the soldiers to behave like the soldiers of David, and the officers to act like David's worthies. Then he made no manner of doubt there would be good news from Cape Breton. After this he preached to the general himself, who asked him if he would be one of his chaplains, but he excused himself and said he should think it an honor, but believed, as he generally preached 3 times a day in various places to large congregations, he could do more service by stirring up the people to pray, and thereby strengthening his and his soldiers' hands. And in this practice he persisted during the siege of Louisbourg. "I believe," adds he, "if ever people went with a disinterested view, the New Englanders did then. But many of them were raw and undisciplined, yet numbers were substantial persons who left their farm and willingly ventured all for their country's good." An amazing scene of Providence appeared, and though some discouraging accounts were sent during the latter end of the siege, yet in about 6 weeks news came of the surrender of Louisbourg. Numbers flocked from all quarters to hear a Thanksgiving sermon upon the occasion, and I trust the blessing bestowed on the country through the thanksgiving of many redounded to the glory of God. The New England people had some time ago offered to build him a large house to preach in, but as this scheme might have abridged his liberty of itinerating, built him a large house to preach in, and as this scheme might have abridged his liberty of itinerating, he thanked him for their kind offer, and at the same time begged leave to refuse the acceptance of it. As his bodily strength increased and his health grew better, he began to move further southward, and after preaching eastward as far as Casco Bay and North Yarmouth, he went through Connecticut, Plymouth, Rhode Island, preaching to thousands generally twice a day. And though, says he was much smoked, yet every day I had more and more convincing proof that a blessed gospel fire had been kindled in the hearts both of ministers and people. At New York, where I preached as usual, I found that the seed sown had sprung up abundantly, and at the east end of New York, east end of Long Island, I saw many instances. In my way to Philadelphia, I had the pleasure of preaching by an interpreter to some converted Indians, and of seeing near 50 young ones in one school near Freehold learning the Assembly's catechism. A blessed awakening had been begun and carried on among the Delaware Indians by the instrumentality of David Brainerd. Footnote. It is a circumstance worthy of note that about the same period that the great head of the church was preparing Monsignor Whitefield, Wesley, and others in England to stem the torrent of infidelity and propagate divine truths, he manifested the same care and concern for the inhabitants of the New World in rising up that burning and shining light, Dr. Jonathan Edwards, to disseminate the seed of eternal life in that barren soul. In the year 1729, the Spirit was poured out from on high, and the divine glory began to shine upon the land. But in the year 1733, there was a very remarkable revival of the work of God in New England, and great numbers of souls were savingly converted unto God. End of the footnote. Such as has not been heard of since the awakening of New England by the Venerable Mr. Eliot, who used to be styled the Apostle of the Indians. His brother followed him. Mr. William Tennant, whose party I found much upon the advance, seemed to encourage his endeavors with all his heart. His brother, Mr. Gilbert Tennant, being early solicited thereto, I found settled in the place formerly erected by at the beginning of the awakening. The gentleman offered me £800 a year, only to preach among them 6 months, and to travel the other 6 months where I would. Nothing remarkable happened during my way southward. But then I came to Virginia. I found that the word of the Lord had run and was glorified. During my preaching at Glasgow, some persons wrote some of my extemporary sermons and printed them almost as fast as I preached them. Some of these were carried to Virginia, and one of them fell into the hands of Samuel Morse. He read and found benefit, and then read them to others, who were awakened and convinced. A fire was kindled. Opposition was made. Other laborers were sent for, and many, both white people and Negroes, were converted to the Lord. In North Carolina, where I stayed too short a time, little was done. At Georgia, through the badness of the institution and the trustees' abstinence in not altering it, my load of debt and care was greatly increased, and at times almost overwhelmed me. But I had the pleasure of seeing one who came as a player from New York, now converted into God and a preacher of Jesus Christ. One, Mr. Rattray, brought me £10, and at my return northward, fresh supplies were raised up. The generous Charleston people raised a subscription of £300, with which I bought land, and it being cheap during the war, and a plantation of few Negroes were purchased at Indian land. Thus, for a while, the gap was stopped. I preached a sermon upon the rebellion, was very sick at Philadelphia, kindly received at Bohemia, and at New York. As itinerating was my delight, and America being a new world, particularly pleasing, he now began to think of returning no more to his native country. But traveling, care, and a load of debt contracted, not for himself but for the orphan house, weighed him down. In his letters during this period are the following passages. August 26, 1746. The door for my usefulness opens wider and wider. I love to range in the American woods, and sometimes think I shall never return to England any more. October 8th, I have had some sweet times with several of the Lutheran ministers at Philadelphia. June 1st, 1747. The congregations yesterday were exceedingly large. I am sick and well, as I used to be in England, but the Redeemer fills me with comfort. I am determined in his strength to die fighting. June 4th. I have omitted preaching one night to oblige my friends, that they may not charge me with murdering myself, but I hope yet to die in the pulpit, or soon after I come out of it. June 23rd. Since my time, I have been several times on the verge of eternity. At present I am so weak that I cannot preach. It is hard work to be silent, but I must be tried every way. September the 11th. We saw great things in New England. The flocking and power that attended the word was like unto that 7 years ago. Weak as I was and have been, I was unable to travel 1,100 miles and preach daily. About this time, being much troubled with stitches in my side, he was advised to go to Bermuda for the recovery of his health. He accordingly embarked and landed there March 15, 1748.